Hello everybody. Today we will continue our lectures in endocrine physiology. Today we will talk about an important glandular structure or neural glandular structure, which is the hypothalamic hypophyseal axis. The hypothalamus is a brain structure. It is a part of what is known as the diencephalon, which is a major division of the brain. It is a very small structure. It's obvious how small this structure is by comparing its weight, which is only 40 grams, to the overall volume of the brain, which is about 1400 grams. But although it's a small size, it has a very important and vital function in our organism. As you know, the hypothalamus involves what is known as osmoreceptors, which actually contribute to the osmoregulation and the fluid electrolyte balance in our organism. It forms a part of what is known as limbic system, which regulate the emotion and behavior in human and animals, of course. It is a major contributor to appetite, as it involves the appetite and satiety centers, as well as the thirsty center. It also contains what is known as a thermostat, which is the regulator of the body temperature. But one of the most important functions of the hypothalamus is being a link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, both of which forms what is known as the major regulatory systems of our body functions. Okay, now let's focus on the role of hypothalamus as a link or as a bonding structure between the nervous and the endocrine system. You know that the master endocrine gland in our organism is the pituitary gland, which is linked to the hypothalamus through what is known as a stalk, this structure. And you know also that the hypothalamus is a pure brain structure. I mean that it has only neurons, no glandular cells. But how the hypothalamus link the nervous and the endocrine system by its bond with the pituitary gland, which is considered to be the master gland in our organism. Okay. Actually, the hypothalamus has two forms of neurons, one or both of which release hormones. And you remember from previous lectures that the hormones released by nervous cell are called neurohormones. So both two types of hypothalamic neurons release hormones or neurohormones. But the first group of neurons that are called hormone secretory neurons are found in the arcuate nucleus and the periventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. These are small cells that release hormones into the median eminence where numerous capillaries found. Now, there is a specific circulatory system that is found here. The superior hypophyseal artery pours into primary capillary bed where the neurons of the anterior nucleus and periventricular neurons release their hormones. And after that, those capillaries pour into a portal vein, which will pour later in a secondary capillary bed that surround the glandular cells of the anterior pituitary gland, and lastly into a vein that will go to the circulation. Okay, the hormones of the hormone secretory neurons in the arcuous nucleus and periventricular nuclei are actually tropic hormones, which means that they have either stimulatory or inhibitory role, we will discuss them later, but let's talk about the other form of connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The other form of neurons found in the hypothalamus, which are larger in size, are found in two hypothalamic nuclei, which are the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus. The axons of those neurons extend and reach the posterior part or posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. For that, the posterior part or the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, as you see, is composed only from the axons of the supraoptic nuclei and periventricular nuclei neurons. The cell bodies are found in the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus, while their axons extend and reach the posterior pituitary gland, and their hormones are stored here until being released into the blood. For that, the posterior lobe of the hypophysis is called the neurohypophysis. Hypophysis, I mean the pituitary gland. The posterior lobe is called neurohypophysis. Why? Because it is composed only of axons of neurons, which cell bodies are found in the supraoptic nucleus and in the paraventricular nucleus. While the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland is called adenohypophysis. Why? Because it is composed, as you see, from different glandular cells. Those glandular cells are called either somatotroph because they release the growth hormone, or lactotroph because they release the hormone prolactin, or the thyrotroph because they release the thyroid stimulating hormone, which later will stimulate the thyroid gland, or corticotroph, which release what is known as adrenocorticotropic hormone that will stimulate the suprarenal cortex later, or the gonadotrophs, which are the FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and LH, the luteinizing hormone. So the anterior pituitary gland is entirely composed of glandular cells, no neurons. For that, it is called the adenohypophysis, while the neurohypophysis is the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland because it only involves axons of neurons, which cell bodies are found in the hypothalamus. Now, the hormones of the anterior nucleus, of arcuate nucleus and periventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, which are small neurons that release neurohormones which have tropic effect, in other words, stimulatory or inhibitory effect on the glandular cells of the anterior pituitary gland. These hormones are small peptides hormones which include the TRH. TRH is an abbreviation of thyrotropin releasing hormone. It is released by the hormone secretory neurons in the hypothalamus and affect special glandular cells in the hypophysis, which are called thyrotrophs, that will release the TSH. So the TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, stimulate the thyrotroph cells in the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which will be poured into the blood and reach the thyroid gland to stimulate it to release the or to release its hormones, which are T3 and T4. The other hormone of the hypothalamus is called gonadotropin releasing hormone. This hormone is also a peptide hormone, a small peptide hormone that will stimulate specific cells in the anterior pituitary gland, which are called the gonadotroph, and they will release the FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and LH or luteinizing hormone. Those hormones or this hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, start to be released in the beginning of puberty. The FSH and LH are actually hormones that regulate the menstrual cycle in the female and the spermatogenesis in the male. The third hormone of the hypothalamus that is released once again by the neurons found in the arcuate nucleus and perivertebral nuclei is the growth hormone releasing hormone. This hormone will affect the somatotrophic or somatotrophs in the anterior pituitary gland to release growth hormone. And the fourth one is the corticotropin releasing hormone that is released by the hormone secretory neurons in the arcuate nucleus and perivertebral nuclei and affect the corticotrophs in the anterior pituitary gland to release what is known as adrenocorticotropic hormones that will later stimulate the suprarenal cortex. Okay. In addition to those stimulatory hormones of the hypothalamus that will stimulate the glandular cells of the anterior pituitary gland to be released, it also has two hypothalamic hormones which have inhibitory role, which are the somatostatin that will inhibit the somatotrophs and impair the release of growth hormone, and the dopamine, which is released to inhibit the lactotroph or mammotroph cells in the anterior pituitary gland and impair the release of the prolactin hormone. Okay. In addition to those hormones that are tropic hormones that stimulate or inhibit the anterior pituitary gland, there are also two hormones released by the hypothalamus, but they are released by the larger cells in the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus. These two hormones are called oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin in 80% or 80% of oxytocin is released by the paraventricular nucleus, neurons in the paraventricular nucleus, and 20% is released by neurons in the supraoptic nucleus. While the antidiuretic hormone, ADH, or it has another name which is vasopressin, 80% of the ADH is released by the supraoptic nucleus and 20% is released by the paraventricular nucleus. Those hormones are quite important. Let's discuss about the functions of the later two hormones, the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin. The antidiuretic hormone acts via receptors that are found in the collecting tubules and collecting ducts of the nephron and act to cause water absorption and urea absorption from the nephron toward the blood to increase the blood volume and to cause a dilution of the plasma and will lead to excretion of concentrated urine. This hormone is activated in dehydration or in thirsty. In other words, when there is a hyperosmolarity in the plasma and we need water to dilute the plasma. For that, it causes the absorption of water from the distal nephron. Distal nephron, as you remember from renal physiology, it involves the collecting tubules, collecting duct, and a part of the distal convoluted tubule. Now, other function of the antidiuretic hormone is causing vasoconstriction, but this effect is obvious when there is a hemorrhage, for example. In this case, it acts via another type of receptors which are called V1 sorry, and found in the blood vessels and cause the vasoconstriction. Okay, the other hormone, which is oxytocin, has different functions. In childbirth or during labor, it causes contraction of the uterus to push the fetus into the birth canal and the vaginal delivery to occur. It also causes contraction of smooth muscles in the mammary gland to cause what is known as milklet reflex, which causes the milklet from the maternal breast into the mouth of the neonate as initial steps in breastfeeding. And it also causes contraction of the non-pregnant uterus during the sexual act in the phase of orgasm to cause the absorption of the seminal fluid by the uterus, or to assist or to facilitate the absorption of the seminal fluid by the uterus. Oxytocin and ADH also have newly discovered function, which is increasing bonding between spouses and between other people. For that, the oxytocin especially is responsible for the strong bond between the mother and the baby after birth, as well as responsible for the strong bond between people, as I mentioned, between the spouses and between friends, between parents and offsprings, and so on. At the end, or at the end of this lecture, let's talk about some clinical notes. ADH hormone. If there is a decrease or lack of ADH hormone, there would be no reabsorption of water in the nephron. This will lead to what? This will lead to increased urination, or what is known as polyuria. And the polyuria will cause dehydration in the body and stimulate the first center, which will lead to the other sign, which is increased water intake, or what is known as polydipsia. As you see, those or these signs and symptoms are similar to the diabetes. But here, the diabetes is not related to insulin or to pancreas because there is no glucoseuria. There is only diluted urine. For that, it is called diabetes insipidus. In other words, tasteless diabetes. Diabetes insipidus is due either to lack or decrease of antidiuretic hormone due to lesion in the neurons that release it, or due to decreased sensitivity of the V2 receptors in the collecting tubules and collecting ducts. In such case, it will be called the nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. So, we have two forms of diabetes insipidus. The central form, when there is a lack or decrease of antidiuretic hormone due to destruction or lesion in the supraoptic nucleus or paraventricular nucleus, mainly the supraoptic nucleus. And the nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, when there is an adequate amount of antidiuretic hormone, but there is no affinity of its receptors in the nephron. Another clinical disorder related to antidiuretic hormone, when there is inappropriate release of antidiuretic hormone. For example, when there are ectopic tumors, especially there are some lung tumors that uncontrollably release antidiuretic hormone that will cause excessive reabsorption of water and dilution of the plasma that will lead to hyponatremia and seizures and convulsion. This disease is called SIADH. which is an abbreviation of syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone. The diabetes insipidus, when it is central or due to decrease or lack of antidiuretic hormone, is treated by a drug which is an agonist for ADH and called desmopressin. Oxytocin has a synthetic form which is used to provoke labor in obstetric and gynecology. This is for now everything related to the endocrine function of the hypothalamus, and during the next lecture we will talk about the hypophyseal hormones. For that time, I wish you all the best and mostly health and welfare. Thank you.